if you want to help my little channel grow big and strong, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard. As I sat around thinking of all the ways in which I could possibly waste the internet's time, it hit me. I know, I'll do another top 10 list. But then I threw that idea away. Because I figured doing a top 20 list would have to be at least twice as effective at wasting your precious time. So today we will have the top 20 Genesis games. These are the games that I either liked best or thought were the most influential on the system. I know 20 games is a lot to take in for one episode, so I've decided to split this into 2 episodes. I'll do the bottom half of the top 20 right now, and the top half of the top 20 will come next week. Why did I decide to do 20 games for real instead of the top 10? Well, there are just so many great, amazing Genesis games out there that I didn't want to limit it to only 10. I would have had to have left out too many really good ones that I wanted to talk about. Now, just a standard disclaimer for any of my top anything videos, these are my opinions. These are the games that I thought were the best or most influential. Your opinions will probably vary, your list would probably look different. We're all allowed to have different opinions, and we can discuss them without arguing because there's no point in doing that, is there? Now, with the exception of one game, all of these were titles that were released officially in the United States. And even the one that I'm going to list that I bent the rules a little bit for is only a sort of exception. And I'll point that out and explain it when we get to that part. So without further ado, here's the list! Bringing up the rear and finishing in 20th place, we have Sega's very own Outrun. You know, this game's reputation has kind of suffered over the years, and I really don't know why. The Genesis version of Outrun is pretty stellar considering the limitations of Sega's 16-bit home hardware. Sega really pulled off a version of Outrun that runs well, sounds great, and plays great too. Outrun came along a few years into the Genesis's life, arriving in 1991. Personally, I think it's the best playing racing game on the Genesis. Yeah, there were a lot of racing games on the system, including some that even used pretty impressive for the time polygon rendering, stuff like F1 Domark. But you know what? In terms of pure driving fun, I think Outrun speeds past the rest of the driving game pack. Is Outrun on the Genesis worth playing today when you can get better than arcade-perfect ports of the game on modern systems? Well, sure it is. You still play old games that run better on other systems, don't you? Don't you? Well, you should. But seriously, I think Outrun on the Genesis is a great port for its time, and the best version of the game for home hardware of that era. That's right, I like it better than the PC Engine port that some people prefer. There's a word that describes those people. Oh, what was it again? Oh yeah, wrong. Quickly and smoothly swiping the 19th spot on the list is Disney's Aladdin. This game was a visual marvel at its time of release in 1993. The character animation was actually handled by Disney directly, and it looked stunning. I remember seeing this game in magazines with all the screenshots and descriptions of the animation before it came out, being really excited for it. And then once I got it, wow! Now I'll come right out and say that I'm not a huge fan of most of the Virgin Disney games. The gameplay in them just lacks a certain degree of polish, and really, that's true of this game as well. It's got some questionable difficulty and collision detection decisions in its big open levels, and those things mar the fun just a little bit. But they don't ruin the game, it's still fun. It's just not quite what it could have been. I enjoyed playing it when it was new, and listening to both the original tunes and the ones that were straight from the movie. Not the best the Genesis sound hardware had to offer, but still pretty well done. Should you play Genesis Aladdin today? Of course! Is it better than the SNES version? Of course! Take it easy, I'm not trying to start a flame war. But I honestly do prefer the Genesis game because, you know, I'm sane. I'm kidding! I'm not sane. Blasting its way into number 18 on the list is MUSHA. MUSHA is part of the Alesta series from Compile. Most of the Alesta games featured intense overhead shooting action on most of the platforms for which they appeared. Power Strike on the Sega Master System was that system's version of the very first game in the series. MUSHA takes that action and 16-bitifies it and dials it up several notches.
Every now and then you want to knock it up a notch with a blast from your Spice Weasel. Bam! Oh yeah, bam it again, Elzar. Knock it up another notch.
MUSHA is my favorite overhead shooter for any system. It has things that a lot of overhead shooters from the era were missing, like a really high intensity level, loads of parallax scrolling, and large fluid sprites. MUSHA also adds some software scaling effects into the mix in some levels, so it looks like things are falling to the ground below or rising up from it. The game was on the cutting edge of 16-bit graphics tech at the time it came out. And the music. Holy cow, the music! Be prepared for the best metal soundtrack on the Genesis. Sorry, Lightning Force fans, I think this one actually is better. On top of all that, it's also a really good game. It's a bit on the easy side at the normal difficulty level, but it does get tougher as you go along, and the last few levels are definitely a challenge. This is not a game that you're likely to blaze through on your very first try. The few minor complaints here might be that some of the levels feel a bit too long, and when you die you lose all your power-ups. It can be really difficult to get back into good fighting shape. Still, with all that said, I think this is by far the best entry in the Alesta series, and any shooter fan should feel right at home with MUSHA. Jetting on a 45-degree angle into the number 17 is Rocket Knight Adventures from Konami. This was one of Konami's earliest Genesis games, and surprisingly a completely original and new property. And this came out before Castlevania and Contra on the system. But you know what? Konami hit it out of the park with Rocket Knight Adventures. While this game may lack name recognition, it makes up for that by being a top-tier Genesis title in just about every respect. It looks great, the animation is top-notch, it has some fancy graphical effects, the gameplay is a lot of fun once you learn the controls, it's pretty challenging, has awesome music, and even a nod or two to some Konami classics. Gradius. Now, what about the game's sequel, Sparkster, you may or may not ask? Well, let's just say that some games are Rocket Knight Adventures, I'm smiling and nodding, and some games are Sparkster, I'm frowning and shrugging. Konami never managed to make a franchise out of this game or character, but that doesn't mean that Rocket Knight Adventures isn't great, because it is! Go play it. Transforming a Pepe Logo into slot 16 on this list is Monster World 4. Normally I wouldn't include a Japanese-only title in a list of Genesis games since, you know, being a Genesis list implies the games were released in North America. This was the game I mentioned earlier that I'd be making an exception for. And why make the exception? Well, Monster World 4 has been officially released in English on multiple platforms including the Genesis Mini. Monster World and Wonder Boy have a complicated history, so allow me to uncomplicate it. It doesn't matter. Just get Monster World 4. There. You need more info? Well, fine. If you like long-form adventure games in which you get new abilities and reach new areas that you could see but not reach before, then this will be right up your alley. It's the prettiest, fastest, and smoothest playing entry in the series, and it's a real shame that this didn't make it to America when it was actually new. There are a few real complaints that can be leveled against this game. One of them is that it's a bit more linear than the other games in the series, and it's also a tad shorter and easier than prior Monster World games. It was over long before I wanted it to be. But really, for a great game, is there any higher praise than that? Well, yes, of course there is, but that's still pretty high, so there! Chucking a dagger straight into the heart of number 15 on the list is the Genesis port of Capcom's Ghouls and Ghosts. Like Strider, which may just appear a little bit higher up on this list, Ghouls and Ghosts was a Capcom arcade game that was ported to the Genesis directly by Sega themselves. This was one of the first games released on Sega's system during its launch window, around the fall of 1989, and it's also the oldest game on this list. It famously won EGM's Game of the Year and got rave reviews, and it's easy to see why. Ghouls and Ghosts showed that the Genesis was going to be a serious player in the industry. It looked, played, and sounded better than just about any other arcade-style platform game on any system at the time. It had all the levels, weapons, gameplay, and music from the arcade version. The animation and backgrounds were cut back a bit, probably due to equal parts of fitting everything into a 5 megabit cartridge and also the developer's unfamiliarity with the new hardware. This is still my favorite version of the game despite its shortcomings. It just feels like it's faster and more responsive than the other versions. Why should you play this over, say, the Super Graphics version? Simple, you most likely don't have a Super Graphics. Also, the sound and music are really grating in that version. Why should you play it over the X68000 version? Simple, you probably don't have an X68000. Why play it over the arcade version? Hey, I already told you, it feels faster and the controls feel tighter. Geez, stop with the third degree and all the objections. Just go and enjoy life already. Whipping the candle containing place number 14 on the list is Castlevania Bloodlines, the lone Genesis entry in the series. Bloodlines was released pretty late in the life cycle of the old Jenny, hitting the US market in December of 1993 and everywhere else in 1994. It's a great game and might even be my favorite Castlevania of the era. You know what? Scratch that. It is my favorite Castlevania of the era. It's just got a more action-oriented, intense, kinetic feel than a lot of the other games in the series. It feels like a Castlevania game that belongs in the arcade, except it's way better than the Castlevania game that was actually released in the arcade. Bloodlines looks good, has a fantastic soundtrack, and plays great. And that soundtrack, by the way, was the first in the series from series veteran Michiru Yamane. I'll be the first to admit that the game lacks a bit of refinement, but everything is put together so well that it's easy to overlook some of the game's minor shortcomings. It's loaded with weird special effects that Konami added to prove, that they know how to make the Genesis do stuff. Meanwhile, some areas of the game look great and some areas look bland. Yeah, they could have really polished things up a tad. Bloodlines is a completely worthy addition to this storied franchise. I really do prefer it to the SNES Castlevanias, which I still like a lot, and I also prefer it to Dracula X Rondo of Blood on the PC Engine CD. I think it's the arcade vibes that this one puts out. Well, that coupled with Michiru Yamane's soundtrack, which deserves a second mention for just how good it is. What? You haven't played this yet? Jeez, go and fix that already! Grinding all the way into place 13 is Phantasy Star 2. Yeah, this game was a tad primitive and bare bones even at the time of its release in 1990. Despite that, it has a great underlying story, a lengthy, difficult quest to play through, and even with a very real grind, was still a total blast to play. Phantasy Star 2 hasn't held up as well as some of the other games on this list, and I fully admit that right away. But it's still good, and I have to account for the fact that it was something really special at the time it came out. For some perspective, this game arrived in the US before the first Final Fantasy came out on the NES. It also came out just a couple of months after the original Dragon Quest/Dragon Warrior release on the NES. In fact, I'd say the only really major RPG that significantly predated Phantasy Star 2 in the US was, let's see, what was it called again? Oh, here it is, something called Phantasy Star for the Sega Master System. Now this game came with a hint book containing a complete solution to it with maps for all the dungeons when it was released, and I needed and used it back in my early teenage days, as this was the first JRPG I'd ever played. At the time of this recording, it's still hard to play this game without it, but some newer releases of the game employ some modern conveniences, like extra experience and Meseta for fights. But if you want to tough it out like the old days, this is still a rewarding experience. It just doesn't have the bells and whistles of newer games in the series. It's a bit tougher to recommend playing this one today, but I still truly love this game, and I played it so often back in the old days that I can't even tell you. And I played through it many times both with and without the hint book. I really long for a modernized remake.
I long for you.
Still, it's worth playing if you go into it with the right mindset. And that mindset is, this game is f***ing hard. Lightning striking the 12th spot, we have the no longer hidden gem, Alisia Dragoon. This game came out in 1992 to absolutely no fanfare. It was compared to games that it was way better than. It quickly seemed to vanish from the face of the earth. Then, many years later, it was suddenly popping up on a bunch of best of and hidden gems lists of Genesis games. And yeah, Alisia Dragoon is a great game and worthy of all the more recent praise it has gotten. Alisia Dragoon was a joint production of Gainax and GameArts. It was published by Sega. It's an arcade-style action game with a unique attack method. It stars a woman that shoots lightning out of her hands that auto-targets enemies in front of her.
Sounds hot.
Yeah, well, settle down, Xena. Anyway, Alisia Dragoon is an arcade-style action platformer that also emphasizes light exploration elements. It also emphasizes awesome because, you know, that's what the game is. The game looks great with a more pronounced organic style than many games of its era, and it doesn't feel as rigidly constructed with basic tiles in the same way that a lot of other 16-bit games did. The graphics and animation are top-notch, has a wonderful use of color, the music is some of the best to ever appear on the system, and the arcade-style exploration-based gameplay is still... Oh shit, I already talked about that, didn't I? Anyway, if you overlooked Alisia Dragoon back in the day, you should correct that problem. It's still a great game. Dropping in at number 11, we have Dr. Robotnick's Mean Bean Machine, perhaps better known as Puyo Puyo. And you know what? Puyo Puyo is a lot easier to say, so I'll just be calling it that from now on. I remember reading a review of this game just before it came out in GameFan, where they compared its two-player mode to the intensity of Street Fighter II, and I thought they were nuts. Until I got the game and played it myself. Man, is this game good. As far as falling block puzzlers go, Puyo Puyo is hands down my absolute favorite series in the entire genre. It's fast, it's intense, you can line up crazy combos and hurt your opponents so much that it can be hilarious. If you're playing with a roughly equally skilled friend, the two-player mode is a riot. The game looks fine for a puzzle game, it's not all that impressive visually, but the music is really good, which isn't a surprise since this was made by Compile. Chances are you've played some version of Puyo Puyo by now. This one doesn't have all the gameplay evolution you'll find in the much newer releases, but it still has its charm, and while it wasn't the first in the series, it was still one of the earliest entries, and is still fun to play today. Why aren't you playing it right now? Jeez. And coming in at number... Oh, gotcha. The rest of the list is coming next week, like I said earlier. So, find out which games were my favorite on the system. Does your favorite game make the list? Will I put something on there that makes you want to murder me? Tune in next week and find out. You know, unless you're watching this after the second part's already been released, in which case you can find out right now. So what are your favorite Genesis games? Go ahead and give them some love in the comments below. With that, I will say thanks for watching, and see me later.